Boy, I wish I had $1 for every hour I've spent in a courtroom just like this. They're usually not quite this empty, but you learn things working in courtrooms. You learn things working cases that I think can help you determine whether or not Christianity is true. Let me give you 2 more that I think will be helpful. First, I got to dispel you of a bad idea you might have about circumstantial evidence. When I just say that word, don't you just think, oh, that's just junk, right? Because how many times have you heard in a news report, they've got a terrible case, it's just a circumstantial case. All they've got is a circumstantial case. You always hear language like that, don't you? It's as if to say that something is deficient about circumstantial evidence. Well, let me just help you understand the broad categories of evidence. There are only 2 forms of evidence we use in any criminal case. Only 2. Direct evidence and indirect evidence, okay? That's it. Everything falls into one of those 2 categories. Now, direct evidence ends up being one kind of thing. Eyewitness testimony. That's right. Everything else is in the category we call indirect evidence. If you don't have an eyewitness who can identify the suspect who committed the crime, you don't have a direct evidence case. Oh, how about DNA? Indirect evidence. Really? Fingerprints? Indirect evidence. Really? Behaviors on the part of the suspect, statements he might make? Indirect evidence. Everything else, if it's not an eyewitness, is indirect evidence. And there's another word for indirect evidence: circumstantial evidence. Now you might think, well, you can't really know anything with certainty if all you're using is circumstantial evidence, can you? Oh, really? All of my cases have been 100% circumstantial. That's the nature of cold case investigations. If we had a living eyewitness who saw this 30 years ago, it would have been solved 30 years ago. It's the fact that we don't have an eyewitness who saw it that puts us into a different category. And now we have to make the case with entirely nothing more than circumstantial evidence. So let me give you an example of how we might build a case using circumstantial evidence. You'll see this in your participant's guide. What if I was looking at a crime that had been committed by a young man who has allegedly killed his girlfriend using a baseball bat? You'll see the illustration in the participant's guide. There's 2 ways we could make that case. In the first illustration, you see it with just an eyewitness who would say, I saw him commit the crime. And if she's so sure that she can identify the suspect, you could make a case on one piece of evidence, the singular eyewitness testimony of the neighbor who saw the crime, and that would be a direct evidence case. Now look at the next illustration. Now you can see that what if we don't have an eyewitness? Or if the eyewitness, if he had a mask on his head, for example, and she can only say, well, I saw about what he looked like in terms of height and weight, but I couldn't identify his face. Well, now I don't have a direct evidence case. Now I've got to do all the other things you see in the diagram. Go out and talk to him and get his alibi. Does that check out? Do I find a murder weapon in his house? Do I find clothing that matches the clothing described by the witness? Does he say anything that actually implicates him? Is he wearing the right kind of shoes? Does he have a key to get in the house? Does he drive the right kind of car that matches the suspect? Do you see how we built the case in a different way now? We don't have an eyewitness in the second form of the case. Instead, we're using many pieces of evidence that all point to the same reasonable inference. This is a great example of the difference between direct evidence cases and indirect evidence cases. Now, what does that mean? Well, it's about building a case on all the other kinds of things that we use to make a truth claim. But I just want you to be clear on one thing. There is no such thing as deficient evidence related to direct evidence. Circumstantial evidence is not somehow less valuable. As a matter of fact, we have a jury instruction. There's a jury instruction in California, for example, where judges tell juries that they are to treat indirect evidence with the exact same value, with the exact same credit they would give direct evidence. So stop saying it's just an indirect case or it's just a circumstantial case, unless you're willing to say it's just a direct evidence case. You would never say that. These are 2 forms of evidence that are to be given the exact same weight in your considerations. I only say that because, of course, we're not going to be able to call a witness in to tell us what Jesus did in the first century. We're going to have to trust the eyewitness accounts and a bunch of other stuff that we would typically label as circumstantial evidence. But that is actually good evidence and a good way to build the case. Let me say one more thing about that. There are many times when I would rather have a circumstantial case, an indirect case, than a direct case. You know why? Because witnesses lie all the time. I mean, I've learned over the years, I've been lied to so many times by witnesses that I've just learned to never, ever trust an eyewitness. So people will say, well, how can you trust what's been written about Jesus? How can you trust what any eyewitness says about any criminal case? Well, listen, I don't trust what they say. I'm with you. But I test them. You don't trust eyewitnesses, you test eyewitnesses. Now, if they pass the test, you are instructed by the judge to trust them. Now, what's the test? Well, that's the second thing I want to teach you in this session, is how to determine if an eyewitness is reliable. Now, in your participant's guide, you will see that there is a list of jury instructions that judges tell jurors, ways and questions to ask in their head when listening to the testimony of eyewitnesses to determine if the eyewitness is reliable. I've given you the entire list in California. You'll see as you read through these, they break into 4 large categories, and here they are to keep it simple. Number 1, was the witness really present when he said he was to see what he said he saw? Number 2, is there some way we can verify or corroborate what the witness has said? 3, has that person been honest and accurate over time, or has he changed or she changed her story? And number 4, does the witness possess a bias that would cause him to be motivated to lie to us? If you can check the boxes in those 4 areas, and all those things check out, you are instructed to trust the witness. Well, wait a minute, I don't know. He's got really beady eyes, and that witness, he reminds me of my Uncle Phil, and my Uncle Phil is such a liar. He even sounds like Uncle Phil. Oh, time out. Does that witness pass the test? I mean, when you check those 4 areas, does he pass the test? Well, yeah. Okay, well then you have to trust him. I don't care you don't like what he looks like, or you don't like how he sounds, or you don't even like what he's saying. If he passes the test, you're to trust him. Now, why is that helpful for us? Well, I didn't believe that the Gospels were true when I first read them. I wasn't even interested in the Gospels per se. I just wanted to know, what did Jesus say? Because the first pastor that got me interested in Jesus, he did it in a simple way. He just told me that Jesus was the smartest man who had ever lived. And I thought, wow, really? Well, I want to know, is he that smart? What did he say? So I buy a Bible and I start reading through just trying to mine out the words of Jesus. And what do I discover? That they are encased in these Gospels, these accounts of something that happened in the first century. So I thought, how would I know if these alleged eyewitness accounts were really reliable, were true, or telling me something true? Well, could I apply that template that I know I use in criminal trials to the Gospel authors? That's why it's so important for us to know how to test eyewitnesses. One last thing before we take a second to give you some tools for your call-out bag. Sometimes people will say, well, don't the Gospels disagree in certain places? Are there variations between these accounts? Doesn't that make them unreliable? Oh, really? I'm here to tell you in advance that witnesses never, ever, ever agree on all the details of their accounts. I've never worked a case where I had 2 witnesses who ever agreed entirely about what they were telling me. This thing could have happened 5 minutes ago. It wouldn't matter. Why do you think the first thing, well, I get called in the middle of the night to go out to a crime scene or to go out to a murder scene. I have one request of the dispatcher who's calling me on the phone. Hey, is there officers on the scene there? Yes, sir, there are. Okay, great. Have them separate the eyewitnesses. Why do I ask for that? Because I don't want to get there and find out they've been talking to each other for an hour and a half, and now I've got one story repeated 4 times. Instead, what I want to see is the kind of variation between the stories that is the hallmark of legitimate, reliable eyewitness testimony. It turns out the variations I saw as a new investigator who was not a Christian reading the Gospels was exactly the kind of variation I would expect to see from reliable eyewitnesses. Do not allow the differences between the Gospels to shake you. That should give you confidence that you're actually reading something true. So now you've got 2 new skills to add to your call-out bag. Number 1, you know the difference in the kinds of categories of evidence between direct and indirect evidence, and you know that making a case circumstantially is a valid way to build a case. And number 2, you also know how to test eyewitnesses. We're going to be doing that later to discover if, in fact, the story of Christianity is true. Those 2 tools will help you to determine the truth about Christianity.